The air inside the Victoria Sports Hall on that humid November evening in 1972 was thick, heavy with the scent of floor wax, nervous anticipation, and the unmistakable static charge that only gathers when 4,000 people are waiting for something extraordinary to happen. It was November 18th, and the atmosphere wasn't just electric, it was predatory. The crowd hadn't packed the arena to watch a simple exhibition. They had come to witness a collision. They had come to see if the legend of the Iron Orchid would finally meet its match. Her name was Yuki Tanaka, and at 28 years old, she was a terrifying force of nature. Born and forged within the unyielding, ironclad discipline of an elite Kyokushin Karate school in Osaka, she was a product of absolute pressure. Her record wasn't just a statistic, it was a warning written in blood and bone. 61 professional fights, 61 victories, 54 knockouts. She was a woman who didn't believe in the concept of defeat because she had never experienced it. The local press in Asia had dubbed her the Iron Orchid, a nickname she despised. She found the flower part of it insulting, implying a delicacy she didn't possess. To her, there was nothing delicate about the way she dismantled human beings. For nearly 7 years, she had chewed up the tournament circuit, spitting out the remains of national champions and international masters alike. 3 national championships, 2 Asian titles, and 1 international grand championship. These weren't just trophies on a shelf, they were the scars left on the reputations of the men and women who dared to stand across from her. No opponent lasted more than 4 minutes. Many didn't even make it past the first round. She didn't fight to win points. She fought to break the spirit of her opposition. Every fighter who stepped into the ring with her started with a flicker of hope, but within moments, Yuki would extinguish it. She wanted them to walk out of that arena, questioning why they had ever picked up a martial art in the first place. She fed on that doubt. In her world, respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you hammered into your opponent until they acknowledged your dominance. While the arena buzzed with the anticipation of her presence, a different kind of energy was swirling around the entrance. Bruce Lee had accepted the invitation to this international masters demonstration, not to conquer or to prove a point, but to share a vision. He was there to talk about the evolution of martial arts, about the necessity of speed, timing, and the efficiency of movement. He hadn't come to wage war. He hadn't even brought a game face. As he walked through the throng of fans, he was the picture of ease. People were mobbing him, reaching out to touch his sleeve, begging for autographs, or just hoping to get a glance of the man who had brought Eastern cinema to the global stage. He greeted every one of them with a genuine, relaxed smile. To Bruce, this was a community, not a battlefield. But from the darkened shadows of a side doorway, Yuki Tanaka was watching. She had her arms tightly folded across her chest, a permanent crease of skepticism etched into her forehead. One of her top students, a young fighter who had been with her for years, nudged her shoulder and whispered, "That's him, Sensei. That's Bruce Lee." Yuki didn't smile. She let out a sharp, cynical laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I expected a fighter," she muttered, her eyes scanning Bruce's frame. "He looks like a movie star." Her student shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the crowd that was currently chanting Bruce's name. "People say he's incredibly fast, Sensei. They say he's the real deal." Yuki shook her head, a sneer curling her lip. "People believe movies because they want to believe in heroes," she replied, turning her back on the scene. "They don't understand the difference between performance and reality. In my world, real fighters don't stand in front of cameras. They collect scars. They don't look for applause." As the event kicked off, the arena transformed into a spectacle of displays. Masters of every discipline took the stage, showcasing their power. One man shattered concrete blocks with his bare knuckles. Another drove his elbow through a stack of wooden boards. The crowd roared with every successful strike, the noise level rising like a tide. It was a carnival of strength, and Yuki watched it all with a cold, detached indifference. She knew the game. She knew how to impress a crowd. But she was waiting for the centerpiece. Finally, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, and the arena erupted. "Bruce Lee." He stepped onto the floor, not like a conquering hero, but like a man walking into his own living room. He wore a simple black kung fu uniform, no medals, no gaudy championship belts, no dramatic swagger. Just a quiet, simmering confidence that was, in its own way, more intimidating than the showiest of fighters. He bowed respectfully to every master on the floor, acknowledging their craft, their time, and their discipline. He reached Yuki, and he bowed to her too, with the same sincere reverence he showed everyone else. Yuki didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't bow back. Bruce noticed. The slight tension in her posture, the rigid set of her shoulders, he saw it all. But he didn't confront it. He simply smiled, a faint, knowing expression, and turned his attention to the task at hand. His demonstration was brief, clean, and terrifyingly efficient. He didn't waste a single movement. He spoke to the crowd about speed without control being nothing more than chaos, and power without purpose being a hollow act. Then, he performed the famous one-inch punch. The volunteer, a man nearly twice his size, flew backward across the mat, as if he'd been struck by a falling tree. The audience lost their minds. The arena shook with the sheer volume of their approval. Everyone was on their feet. Everyone, except Yuki. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of granite. She clapped once, a single, sharp, mocking strike of palm against palm. Then, she stopped. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was a declaration of war. She began to walk onto the mat, cutting through the fading applause like a knife. The announcer faltered, looking confused. The event officials started whispering, their hands twitching nervously, unsure if they should intervene. But the moment was already moving too fast for them to stop. Yuki picked up a microphone from the floor, her eyes locked onto Bruce like a laser. "Is that," she asked, her voice ringing out clearly over the hushed crowd, "what impresses people these days?" The arena fell silent instantly. You could have heard a pin drop on the concrete floor. Bruce turned to face her, his expression still calm, still unbothered, as if he were having a polite conversation over tea. "It is one way of expressing martial arts," he replied, his tone even and inviting. Yuki laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the rafters. She pointed a finger directly at his chest. "No," she spat. "That is theatre." The discomfort in the room was palpable. The spectators shifted, looking at their feet, wishing they were anywhere else. But Yuki wasn't finished, and she wasn't going to let the moment pass. "You make actors believe they're fighters," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, turning into a lecture that felt more like an indictment. "You teach children that speed is more important than discipline. You sell dreams, Bruce. You don't build warriors." Bruce bowed his head slightly, a gesture of grace in the face of blatant disrespect. "Everyone is free to have an opinion," he murmured. That was the spark. That calmness, that refusal to get angry, infuriated her more than a direct attack ever could. She had come here expecting a reaction, expecting a defense, expecting the ego of a man who needed to protect his reputation. Instead, she found a mirror, and she didn't like what it was showing her. She took a step closer, invading his space, her eyes narrowing into slits. "If you're a real martial artist," she hissed, low enough that only he could hear, "then fight me." The crowd gasped. The challenge was out there, hanging in the air, undeniable and lethal. The stage was set, not just for a match, but for a reckoning. The arena exploded. The silence that had held the crowd captive for those few heartbeats shattered into a cacophony of shouting, jeering, and frantic movement. Reporters were scrambling off their chairs, camera flashes began to strobe across the mat, and the air turned thick with the distinct, metallic tang of impending violence. For 4,000 people, the dynamic had shifted from a polite educational seminar to a gladiatorial spectacle in the blink of an eye. Bruce Lee didn't flinch. He didn't take a defensive stance, nor did he puff out his chest. He simply looked at Yuki with a level of patience that, in the heat of that... The audience was torn. A section of the crowd began to boo, their bloodlust rising, wanting to see if the legend could actually back up his fame. Others, however, went quiet, struck by the gravity of his words. The tension was a physical presence, wrapping around the two figures on the mat like a tightening coil. Yuki, seeing the crowd lean toward her provocation, pushed harder. Her face hardened, the mask of the professional fighter slipping to reveal the raw aggression beneath. "You refuse because you know," she hissed, stepping into his personal space, her eyes daring him to break his composure. "You know what will happen. You know that out here, on this mat, your movie magic won't save you." Bruce looked directly into her eyes, unblinking. It wasn't a stare down, it was an attempt at connection. "I refuse," he said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded attention, "because I respect you, and because martial arts should unite people, not create more broken bodies." For a fleeting second, the energy in the room shifted. A ripple of something like shame passed through the front rows. It seemed for a heartbeat that the standoff might end. But Yuki wasn't interested in redemption. She was interested in validation. She took one more step, invading the space until she was close enough that every camera lens in the building captured the defiance burning in her expression. "So," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, designed to cut, "the famous Bruce Lee is only brave when the cameras are rolling. You call yourself a master, but the truth is, you're afraid of a woman." A collective gasp went up from the stands. The jab was ugly, personal, and calculated to draw blood. Any other man would have snapped. Any other fighter would have launched an attack just to save face. But Bruce stood still. He didn't move a muscle. It was as if he were an anchor in a raging sea, completely unmoved by the turbulence crashing against him. "You call yourself a master," she continued, her voice rising now, echoing off the rafters, "but you're afraid to prove it. If your students are watching, they should leave right now, because today they're going to learn that their teacher is nothing more than a performer." Bruce closed his eyes for a single second. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. When he opened them, the expression on his face remained identical to how it had been minutes ago, calm, focused, and profoundly still. "I will not fight out of pride," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent space. "I will not fight just because someone insults me. I will only fight if there is something worth teaching." Yuki's eyes lit up with a dangerous gleam. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally forced his hand. "Good," she grinned, a predatory expression that had haunted opponents for years. "Then let me teach you." She turned toward the crowd, raising her hand to command the arena, her voice booming with the confidence of someone who had never known what it meant to hesitate. "If Bruce Lee refuses this challenge," she shouted, "he should never call himself a martial artist again." The arena went nuclear. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a physical wall of sound that demanded a climax. Journalists were sprinting toward the edge of the mat, their notepads forgotten. Photographers were climbing onto chairs, risking their footing just to get a better angle. The world's attention was fixed on that singular point on the floor. Bruce didn't react to the noise. He didn't look at the cameras. For several long, agonizing seconds, he just looked at Yuki. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he began to undress. He removed his black jacket, folding it with a level of care that felt entirely out of place given the volatile energy of the room. He walked over to a wooden chair beside the mat, placed the jacket down, and returned to the center. He looked at Yuki, his gaze locking with hers, and spoke just 7 words that would define the rest of the night. "I hope you're ready to learn as well." The entire arena fell into a deathly, expectant silence. Nobody in the crowd, not even the experts in the front row, realized what was truly happening. They thought it was the start of a fight. They thought they were about to see a clash of titans. They didn't understand that Bruce Lee had already begun the fight long before the first strike was thrown. He hadn't just accepted a challenge, he had accepted a student. And in doing so, he had already changed the terms of the engagement. He stepped barefoot onto the mat, not with the hurried aggression of a fighter looking for a knockout, but with the steady, measured gait of a teacher entering a classroom. The 4,000 people inside the Victoria Sports Hall became completely silent. The reporters stopped writing. The photographers froze. Yuki Tanaka stood across from him, her muscles coiled, her eyes tracking every micro-movement of his body. She was expecting hesitation. She was expecting the nervous twitch of a man who knew he was about to be humiliated. She was expecting excuses. Instead, when she looked at Bruce, she saw something that unsettled her to her core. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. The referee, clearly rattled by the sudden shift, stepped between them. He looked at the two figures, his voice trembling slightly as he set the ground rules. "This is a demonstration," he stammered. "No intentional injuries. The match ends immediately if either fighter requests it." Bruce nodded, a sign of respect for the rules. Yuki, however, barely spared the referee a glance. Her eyes were locked onto Bruce, like a predator tracking a deer. "State your names," the referee commanded. "Yuki Tanaka," she snapped. The referee turned, looking to the other side. Bruce smiled, a genuine warm expression that didn't belong in a ring. "Bruce Lee." The referee nodded, trying to regain his composure. "Bow." Bruce bowed immediately, a deep, respectful gesture that honored both his opponent and the discipline they shared. Yuki barely lowered her head, a shallow, dismissive movement that screamed of arrogance. The audience noticed it. Bruce noticed it too, but he said nothing. He simply rose from the bow, his hands coming up into a loose, fluid stance. As the referee stepped back, giving them the space to begin, Bruce raised one hand, pausing the moment. Yuki frowned, her patience fraying at the edges. "What now?" Bruce looked at her, his voice calm, almost conversational. "We don't have to do this." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Yuki laughed, a harsh, sarcastic sound. "Afraid already?" Bruce shook his head, his eyes soft. "No, I simply don't believe that proving who is stronger makes either of us better." She stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom. "You still have time to walk away." Bruce answered quietly, and for a moment, his words seemed to... 3 attacks became 5, then 8, then 12. The air around them was filled with the sound of snapping fabric and the whistle of displaced air. To the casual observer, it looked like Bruce was barely surviving, trapped in the path of a storm. But to the few masters watching from the front rows, the truth was becoming clear. Bruce wasn't being overwhelmed. He was conducting a study. He was reading her, calculating every variable of her technique, and effectively turning the fight into a diagnostic. Yuki's face began to contort with genuine frustration. She had never experienced this. Her opponents usually panicked, covered up, or tried to trade blows in a desperate, losing attempt at aggression. To have her most vicious combinations ignored, treated like a series of questions she had failed to answer, was maddening. She threw a side kick that landed with a dull, heavy thud against Bruce's thigh. The impact echoed across the quiet hall. For the first time, Bruce's leg buckled slightly. He winced, a momentary flash of human reaction, and the crowd roared in triumph. "There!" she screamed, her voice cracking with intensity. "I finally touched you!" Bruce straightened, took a breath, and nodded with genuine appreciation. "A good kick," he said calmly, his voice projecting a strange, calm warmth. She snarled, stepping back to reset. "Stop complimenting me! Fight me!" Bruce smiled, a small, knowing upturn of the lips. "I'm complimenting your technique, not your ego. I am not your student, but you are still teaching me." That was the line that pushed her over the edge. She didn't want to teach. She wanted to conquer. She shrieked, a raw sound of pure fury, and charged again. This time, she abandoned all pretense of precision. She threw everything into the fire. Elbows, knees, wild hooks, and overhead strikes. She was spending her stamina at an alarming rate, turning her own momentum against herself. Bruce didn't retreat. He flowed. He was like a ghost in the machine, shifting through gaps in her defense that didn't exist until the very millisecond he occupied them. The crowd was mesmerized. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a demonstration of absolute mastery. Every time Yuki's fist passed where Bruce's head had been a fraction of a second before, the air seemed to shiver. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Yuki was drenched in sweat, her chest heaving, her shoulders rising and falling in the ragged rhythm of a fighter hitting the wall of fatigue. Bruce, by contrast, looked as though he had just stepped out for a walk in the park. His breath was steady, his eyes clear. He leaned in, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear over the low hum of the crowd. "You're fighting your anger now, not me." She gritted her teeth, her voice coming out as a strained rasp. "I'm fighting you. I'm fighting you until you fall." Bruce shook his head, his voice tinged with a quiet, pervasive sadness. No, you stopped fighting me 2 minutes ago. You've been wrestling with your own demons ever since we stepped on this mat. The words hit her harder than any physical strike ever could. She faltered, stumbling back as the truth of the statement landed in the pit of her stomach. She knew he was right. Her focus was shattered, her rhythm was gone, and the confidence that had defined her entire life was beginning to crack, spiderwebbing out from the center of her pride. She stood there, gasping for air, staring at him. Bruce stood in the center of the mat, his hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes searching hers not for a weakness to exploit, but for a breakthrough to facilitate. The audience had shifted too. The bloodlust that had characterized the start of the match had vanished. They weren't looking for a knockout anymore. They were looking at Bruce Lee with a new kind of intensity, trying to decode the secret of his stillness. Yuki wiped the sweat from her eyes, her voice barely a whisper, devoid of its earlier venom. "Why?" she asked, the question hanging between them like a challenge. "Why won't you fight me? Why won't you finish this?" Bruce answered gently, his voice carrying the weight of a mentor speaking to a pupil. "I am fighting you, but winning isn't always about the force of your strike. Sometimes it is about the strength of your understanding." Yuki looked at him, confused, her eyes flickering with a mix of anger and bewilderment. She tried to steady her hands, to force herself back into the mindset of a destroyer, but the internal foundation was gone. She was no longer fighting for the championship, she was fighting for her own sanity. And Bruce, the man she had insulted in front of thousands, was the only one in the building who truly understood what she was going through. The stage was set for the final, inevitable conclusion, a moment that would change the trajectory of her life forever. The silence in the Victoria Sports Hall was deceptive. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet, the sort that only happens right before the sky rips open. Yuki Tanaka, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming with the effort of the last 10 minutes, did something that made every experienced fighter in the building lean forward. She lowered her stance. It wasn't a casual shift. It was a complete transformation of her center of gravity, a deep, rooted crouch she reserved for only one purpose: the kill. Her students in the front rows stiffened, recognizing the posture. They knew this stance. Whenever Sensei hit this mark, the fight ended within seconds. It was the signature maneuver that had ended the careers of men twice her size. It was raw, unrefined, and terrifyingly fast. Bruce saw it too. For the first time since he had stepped onto the mat, the playful curiosity in his eyes vanished. His expression hardened into something sharper, more focused. He didn't tense up, but he stopped drifting. He planted his feet. He had finally seen everything he needed to see. The data was collected, the pattern was decoded. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was deciding the outcome. The referee, sensing the lethal change in the air, took an involuntary step backward. "If either of you feels unsafe," he stammered, his voice thin, "I will stop this. Now." Neither of them blinked. Neither of them answered. Their world had shrunk down to the space between them. For the first time, Bruce raised both of his hands, not in a defensive guard, but in an invitation. It was a gesture that seemed to say, "Okay, let's see it." "There you are," Yuki hissed, a ragged, desperate smile tearing across her face. "I was beginning to think you didn't know how to fight." Bruce looked at her, his voice devoid of malice. "I was waiting until you finished introducing yourself." She frowned, confused. "What does that mean?" "For the last 7 minutes," Bruce said, his words quiet but carrying to every corner of the arena, "you've been showing me your habits, your rhythm, your breathing, your balance. You haven't been fighting me. You've been telling me your life story. I know you, Yuki." The psychological impact of that sentence was catastrophic. It unsettled her more than any blow ever could. It stripped away her power. With a wild, guttural scream, she exploded forward. She didn't hold anything back. It was a spinning hook kick, blurred by speed, meant to decapitate. She followed it instantly with a reverse punch that cracked the air, and a jumping knee that was meant to crush his ribs. 3 elite, lethal techniques launched in less than 2 seconds. The crowd didn't even have time to react. To them, it was just a blur of motion. But to Bruce, it was slow motion. He didn't go backward. He went forward. He stepped inside the arc of her kick, his hand redirecting her wrist with the lightness of a breeze. He pivoted, sliding into the blind spot created by her jump, and stood exactly where she was going to land. He didn't strike. He didn't have to. He simply occupied the space she intended to move into. Yuki's knee stopped inches from his chest. Her punch hit nothing but empty air. The momentum of her own aggression carried her stumbling past him, her feet scraping frantically against the mat as she tried to regain her balance. She spun around, chest heaving, eyes wide with genuine shock. Nobody had ever closed that distance. Nobody had ever walked through her most lethal combination without throwing a single punch. "Impossible," she whispered, her confidence shattering. Bruce just stepped away, keeping his distance. "Too much commitment," he said, as if correcting a student during a rehearsal. "You gave everything to the attack and nothing to the defense. You weren't fighting, you were hoping." The crowd erupted into a chaotic roar. Some were cheering for Bruce, but a significant portion of the audience, driven by the primal urge to see blood, began to turn on her. "Finish her, Bruce!" someone screamed from the balcony. "Knock her out! End it!" The chant started small, then grew, spreading like wildfire through the stands. "Finish her! Finish her! Finish her!" It was the ultimate test. The hero had been insulted, the woman had been reckless, and the mob demanded a trophy. They wanted to see the iron orchid laid out on the mat. They wanted the narrative of destruction. Bruce didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at Yuki. She was standing there, defeated, her guard broken, her chest heaving. She was waiting for the blow. She expected him to finish what she had started. She expected the violence she had preached all her life. But Bruce did something that shocked them all. He slowly lowered his hands. He took a long, deliberate step back and stood in a resting position. The roar of the crowd turned into a confused murmur, then a simmering anger. "What are you doing?" the man in the front row yelled. "She's open. Hit her!" Bruce turned slowly to face the audience. The noise in the hall didn't faze him. He raised a single hand, and his presence was so absolute that the arena, slowly, reluctantly, fell silent. Even the photographers, their fingers hovering over the shutters, stopped. "You came here," Bruce said, his voice ringing out with such clarity it could have been a whisper in a library, "to watch martial arts." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But some of you are asking to watch revenge." He scanned the faces in the front row, his expression not angry, but deeply, profoundly disappointed. "They are not the same thing." He turned back to Yuki. She hadn't moved. She was staring at him, her eyes searching his face for the mockery she expected, but finding only a calm, terrifying kindness. Bruce walked toward her. He didn't march, he glided. When he reached her, he stopped, just a few feet away. She was trembling, not from the physical exertion, but from the realization of what had just happened. She had laid her soul bare, and he had chosen not to destroy it. He extended his hand. It was the most radical act of the entire night. "I could have ended this minutes ago," he said, his voice audible only to her and the few nearby. "But winning wasn't the goal. The goal was to see if you were willing to learn." She looked at his hand, then up at his face. The iron orchid, the woman who had broken 61 fighters, looked like a child who had just realized she had been holding a toy sword in a real war. "Why?" she whispered, the tears finally welling up, blurring her vision. "Why are you helping me?" "Because," Bruce said, his voice soft, "strength without respect is just weakness in disguise. You have the strength, Yuki. You've always had it. But you've been using it to fill a hole in your life that no amount of fighting can ever patch." The atmosphere in the hall had shifted entirely. The bloodlust was gone, replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. The crowd wasn't watching a fight anymore. They were watching a confession. And in that moment, the woman who had sought to destroy Bruce Lee was being dismantled, not by his fists, but by his mercy. She had walked in looking for a brawl, and she was leaving with the weight of the world on her shoulders. The silence that filled the Victoria Sports Hall was no longer the heavy, suffocating air of tension. It was the profound, resonant quiet of a congregation witnessing something sacred. For a few heartbeats, the 4,000 spectators didn't move. They simply watched as the two figures stood in the center of the mat, no longer opponents, but two souls bound by an invisible thread of understanding. Yuki Tanaka finally reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she took Bruce's. He didn't just help her up. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, grounding her, steadying her. As she regained her footing, the iron Orchid looked down at the mat, then back at the man who had effortlessly dismantled her entire worldview without throwing a single punch. Her ego, the armor she had worn for 7 years, lay shattered on the floor, and in its place was a raw, vulnerable humanity she hadn't felt in a decade. Bruce didn't gloat. He didn't turn to the cameras. He simply stood beside her, acknowledging the shared space. Then, he did something that broke the remaining dams of the audience's cynicism. He bowed. It wasn't the shallow, ritualistic bow of the start of the match. It was deep, slow, and full of grace. He was bowing to the student, not the enemy. Yuki, tears now openly streaming down her face, lowered her head in a bow of her own, the deepest, most sincere movement of her life. She was no longer performing for the crowd. She was honoring the teacher. When they rose, the roar that erupted from the stands wasn't the bloodthirsty screaming of before. It was a standing ovation. It was a thunderous, collective release of emotion. People weren't cheering because someone had won. They were cheering because they had witnessed a rare, beautiful moment of grace that transcended the brutality of the ring. The referee walked to the center of the mat, looking between the two fighters. He realized that declaring a winner would have been an insult to what had just occurred. He simply raised both their hands and smiled. "There is no winner tonight," he announced to the cheering crowd. "Only 2 martial artists." After the event, the atmosphere in the back corridors of the stadium was electric. The journalists, usually focused on strike counts and knockouts, were frantic, scribbling notes that had nothing to do with fighting. One reporter, a veteran of the martial arts beat, caught up to Bruce as he was leaving. "Mr. Lee," the reporter panted, trying to keep pace. "Why didn't you knock her out? You had her open. You could have solidified your dominance right there in front of everyone." Bruce stopped and turned, his expression serene. "Because my goal was never to defeat her," he said, his voice steady. "My goal was to help her become better. If I had knocked her out, she would have only learned that there is always someone bigger and stronger. By choosing not to, she learned that there is something more important than strength, the capacity to grow." Another reporter shouted, "Weren't you angry? She insulted you, she belittled your craft. How did you stay so calm?" Bruce smiled. "If another person's words can control your actions, they have already defeated you. To be a warrior is to be the master of your own mind. If you are enslaved by your anger, you are not a master of anything." While Bruce was holding court, Yuki sat alone in the dim light of the empty locker room. Her championship belt, the object she had defined her entire existence by, lay on the bench beside her. It looked dull, insignificant. She replayed the fight in her mind, the movement, the stillness, the way Bruce had navigated her frustration. She realized that he hadn't just beaten her in the final exchange. He had defeated her the moment he chose compassion over revenge. He had stripped away the bitterness that had been rotting her from the inside out. For the first time in her career, she felt light. The following morning, the headlines across Hong Kong didn't speak of a victory or a defeat. They spoke of a revelation. "The greatest blow was never thrown," read one. "Bruce Lee wins without seeking victory," read another. The city was talking about martial arts not as a means to hurt, but as a path to enlightenment. Months passed, and the echoes of that night traveled far beyond the Victoria Sports Hall. In the quiet industrial city where Yuki ran her dojo, the atmosphere changed completely. The students who walked through the heavy wooden doors, expecting to learn how to break bones and crush spirits, were met with a different kind of training. The first lesson of the new curriculum wasn't a strike. It was a bow. Yuki began to teach her students that the body is only as strong as the character that directs it. She told them the story of that night, not as a fable, but as a confession of her own past failures. She taught them that power is easy to cultivate, but true mastery is the hardest thing in the world to build. Whenever a new student asked why they had to spend so much time on philosophy and patience, Yuki would simply smile and point to the wall. There, framed in simple wood, was a photograph taken by a journalist at the end of that fateful night. It showed Bruce Lee and Yuki Tanaka standing side by side, both smiling, both bowing, with no trophy, no belt, and no bravado. Just two people who had found a common language in the silence between strikes. Years later, when Yuki was older, her hair streaked with silver, and her movements slower but more deliberate, one of her most gifted students, a young fighter with a fire in his eyes that reminded her of her younger self, approached her. "Sensei," he asked, looking at the photograph, "who taught you your greatest lesson? Who turned you from a fighter into a master?" Yuki looked at the picture, her eyes misty with memory. She thought of the stinging, ego-driven girl she had been, and then of the man who had stood on that mat with the world watching, refusing to play the game of hate. She remembered the feeling of his hand helping her up, a gesture that had saved her from a life of hollow aggression. "A man," she answered, her voice soft but firm, "who could have easily broken me, but chose to build me instead." She paused, looking out at her students, seeing the future in their faces. "He taught me that a true warrior does not look for someone to dominate. A true warrior looks for someone to elevate. The difference between a fighter and a master is not found in the strength of their hands, but in the depth of their heart." The lesson, born from the friction of that one night in 1972, rippled outward. It became a whisper, then a shout, eventually weaving itself into the very fabric of how martial arts were taught and understood. It wasn't just about the physical legacy of Bruce Lee, but the spiritual one. In the end, that night was never about the kicks or the punches. It wasn't about who was faster or who was stronger. It was a mirror held up to the human condition. It showed the world that when you face your worst enemy, you are actually facing your own ego. And the greatest victory you can ever achieve isn't the one you win over an opponent in the ring. It's the one you win over the darkness within yourself. As the years rolled on, the story of the Iron Orchid and the legend who refused to crush her became a legend in its own right. A timeless reminder that while violence may capture the attention of the crowd for a moment, it is mercy and wisdom that capture the history of the world. And so, the cinematic flow of that encounter never truly ended. It continued in every dojo, where a student learned that their greatest opponent wasn't the person standing across from them, but the person looking back at them in the mirror.